number. I don't know if you saw me counting the number of people. Somewhere between 39 and 55 or 56. Why are those numbers significant? Well, there were 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence. 55 people went to Philadelphia to craft out our Constitution. 39 of them ended up signing it. That's a group about the size of the people in this room. And they changed human history. They changed human history because they struck upon an idea that had never before been struck upon. In the Declaration of Independence, they said, for the first time, that the people are sovereign. See, what they did, what those guys did, was commit treason against the existing order. Right? We have to recognize that. That last line in the Declaration of Independence, when they pledged to each other their lives and their fortunes and their sacred honor, the lives was first on that list for a very good reason. If they didn't succeed in this, they'd all committed treason, and they would suffer the punishment at the time for treason. The same punishment we have today for treason. Right? What made it right, even though it was against the existing constitutional order? This is the question that's perplexed mankind for all time. What made it right was because there was a higher law that they were vindicating. You see, in the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, they make an appeal to a candid world based on principles drawn from nature, that's our human reason, and nature's God, revelation. And what do those two things simultaneously teach us? Well, Jefferson goes on in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence and tells us. It tells us that there are certain self-evident truths that are knowable to all people at all times. If we just think about them, if we understand the terms, it becomes self-evident that all men, all human beings are created equal. Because it's inherent in the nature of mankind that we are not equipped to be governed by somebody else without our consent, unless that other person is God. Because then we have to obey him whether we give our consent or not. Or unless that other person is a beast of burden. We don't have to ask their consent before we make a hamburger out of them or ride them into battle. See, there's a natural hierarchy of things, and it becomes self-evident once you understand the terms that no man is so low to another as to be deserving to be ridden like a horse, and no man is so superior to another as to be able to rule like God rules us without our consent. That's inherent in the nature of those terms. That's what makes it self-evident. And a corollary of that is once you accept that proposition as self-evidently true, then there are certain corollaries that flow from that. Because we are equal human beings in God's eyes, we have certain unalienable rights that come from him that are not gifts from each other by compact or given to us as the benefit of a benevolent government. They are inalienable because they come to us by our very nature from our God. And then once you establish those two propositions, something else necessarily follows. That what is the purpose of government but to secure those inalienable rights? That's all. Nothing else. Nothing else. And the only legitimate governments are those that are grounded on consent. Because if the government is not grounded on consent, then it's somebody else imposing their will on you. And it violates that first proposition that we're all created equal. It's self-evidently true. So all of those things become part of what the foundation for our Constitution. Now, the Constitution itself was unconstitutional. Well, think about it. What was our Constitution in 1776? We threw off one and we adopted another. What was it? It was the Articles of Confederation. It treated each state as a separate sovereign nation, and they came together in a compact, a treaty. And they had a national legislature to kind of coordinate the war effort. And it was kind of weak. One of the provisions of the Articles of Confederation said that nobody can change it but by unanimous consent. And so at that Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, one of the states, Rhode Island had a really nice port. And everybody going into Connecticut and in New Hampshire and in the western part of Massachusetts had to go into the port of Rhode Island and pay taxes to Rhode Island in order to get their goods to their part of the state. Rhode Island was a pretty good deal. It's like they had the lowest tax in the country because they got all this money from the port that wasn't taxing their own people. And they were darned if they were going to let that Articles of Confederation get changed and take away that good deal they had. So they didn't even show up in Philadelphia to the Constitutional Convention, saying we can't change the Articles of Confederation, but by unanimous consent, And if we don't show up, they can't get unanimous consent, so we'll be able to keep our good deal here. So what did the folks in Philadelphia do? The Constitution didn't have unanimous consent. Does that mean it's unconstitutional? No, it was unconstitutional under the existing system. But the existing system was given to us by authority of the states. What are the states? The states were agents of the people. The brilliance of James Madison and James Wilson, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, the others that were at that Constitutional Convention was to recognize where the real source of sovereign authority is. And it's not in government. It's in the people. And under the existing constitutional system, they had to get the permission of the unanimous consent of all 13 states to make changes. But that was going to the states. They said, let's look back to that even more sacred faith that we articulate in the Declaration of Independence, that it is the right of the people always to alter or abolish their governments when they cease to become protective of the ends for which they are established, which is to secure our inalienable rights. I couldn't go just to the states, but I could go to that higher authority, the people. And that's why the first three words of the Constitution are not we the states of the United States, but we the people. They made an appeal to the higher authority in order to get over this problem of unanimous consent required under the Articles. And they were able to do that because the Declaration rightly recognized that the source of all sovereign authority is the people. They weren't going to go just to the agent, they went to the principle. They went to the source of authority, to the people. And it was the people that ratified this. Now, who could it ratify? Because remember, all government has to be grounded in consent. And if the people of Rhode Island didn't want to participate in this new constitutional system, we couldn't force them to, because that would violate that principle of consent. So look at the ratification clause in the Constitution. It says it becomes valid when ratified by 9 of the states. But who was it binding on once ratified? Only those states ratifying it. It wasn't binding on Rhode Island and North Carolina until many years later when they actually joined. Right? Because otherwise that would have violated that principle of consent. So we've now got the basic structure and authority for the Constitution. But there are some other things as well. These guys were brilliant. They understood there was a deep problem. That the purpose of government is to protect those inalienable rights. And government, therefore, has to be strong enough to do it. But a government so strong to protect us all in our inalienable rights is also so strong that it could become the chief violator of those rights. So the trick was to create a government strong enough to secure our rights that wouldn't become so strong that would destroy our rights, that would infringe our liberty. And how do you do that? Power, by the way, I've taken the oath as well. I'm a lawyer. I know. Just because 98% of the people in my profession give us all a bad name, don't hold it against all of us. But we take the same oath as my son took when he went off to the Air Force Academy. We take that same oath. All right? Too many in my profession don't even pay attention to it. Too many in too many professions don't pay attention to the oath. They had to figure out this problem, how to keep the government strong enough to secure our inalienable rights, to protect us against enemies, foreign and domestic. And remember, if we hadn't stayed unified, we were going to get gobbled up by the European powers very quickly. We had to figure this thing out. But we had to make sure that we did not create a government that would itself become the principal source of the problem. And how did they do it? Well, the first thing they did, following a philosopher from France named Montesquieu, they divided the powers of government up into separate branches. Checks and balances, separation of powers. Legislative, executive, and the judicial shall never be combined, because the combination of all those is the very definition of tyranny. So the Constitution is structured. There's nothing in there. The words separation of powers do not exist, but the very structure of it. Article 1, the legislative powers herein granted. Only those herein granted, I might add. 2, the executive power. 3, the judicial power. The structure is separation of powers. It's vintage Montesquieu. But they improved upon Montesquieu, because Montesquieu was writing for a small republic, kind of the old Athenian city-state. The other problem they confronted, how do you have a republican form of government over an expansion, a vast expanse, which, they didn't know how far away the far ocean was, but they knew eventually they were going to get there. and that there would be a whole continent under the authority of this one central government. And they were afraid that a government that supervised or controlled such a vast expanse of territory would become as tyrannical as Empire of Rome. They were concerned about it. So how did they do it? They said, we're only going to give to the national government those things that are necessary to be exercised at a uniform and national level. National defense, foreign and interstate commerce, the control of the military, the uniformity of our currency and of our bankruptcy laws, the protection of science and inventions. These things that needed to be done at the national level, because if you had an individual state doing them, you would be perpetually at war with each other among the states. But only those things that could be done best at the national level. Everything else was going to be done at a different state level. And here was the new contribution to political theory that our founders came up with. Because everybody thought when you created a government, that was the sovereign, and that the sovereign authority had to exist in the government itself, whether it be the king, or the czar, or the parliament, or the church. That was the sovereign. Now they figured out that the people were the sovereign, and we could delegate portions of our sovereign authority to different levels of government. Now, if you were to say the threat to liberty is the government, it would have been counterintuitive to say, well, so let's double down and have more governments to make our liberty protected more. But in fact, that's exactly what it did. Because it gave us, at the local level, the things that were going to be more directly involved with regulating our day-to-day lives. And we knew who we would elect as a city council, or to the county board, or the water district, or all those local governments. We knew them because we went to school with their kids. We taught soccer to their nieces. We knew them, and we knew how to get them out of office. We didn't send them 3,000 miles away. And the vast powers of government, the day-to-day things, were going to occur at the local level where we would be more directly involved. And only those things that we couldn't handle at the local level would be delegated to the national government. And to make sure that the national government stayed within its sphere, those state governments were going to be the 800-pound gorilla in our corner. Not to protect their governing prerogatives, but by counterbalancing the expansive tendencies of the national government, we would secure liberty to individuals by having that other layer of government in our corner. This was the theory. And for the first 150 years of our nation's history, it worked brilliantly. It worked brilliantly. And then we get to the Great Depression. And the national government decides they know better how to solve day-to-day things than the people in the day-to-day communities. And a lot of people said, well, let's let them do that. And initially, the Supreme Court struck down these efforts to expand the powers of the national government, to take over things not just of national concern, but of local concern. And the Supreme Court was striking them down, saying that's unconstitutional. You can't regulate what so-and-so grows in his backyard because it's not interstate commerce. You can't tell a farmer he can't grow enough wheat to feed his family because it's not interstate commerce. And the president at the time threatened to pack the court. That if you don't go along with what we're trying to do here, we're going to double the size of the court so that your vote becomes irrelevant. And I'll appoint all the new people, and that court will uphold every unconstitutional act I'm doing. And there was a guy on the court who changed his vote. Now there's some dispute in the scholarship on whether he did it in response to this pressure or he was leaning that direction anyway, but he changed his vote and he started upholding these unconstitutional acts of the federal government that expanded the federal government into the day-to-day governing, the things that were reserved to the states by the 10th Amendment. And so, a famous case, Wickard versus Filburn. And by the way, there's a wonderful documentary that I did with Reason TV, if you want to watch it when you get home. Just Google. Can we say that Google always has this weird connotation to me?
Bang it.
Yeah, it's called, if you Google wheat, weed, and Obamacare, you'll see the Reason TV documentary on the Commerce Clause and how they expanded the understanding of the Commerce Clause. The power that was given to the national government was to regulate trade, commerce, among the states and with foreign nations and with the Indian tribes. And we wanted to be uniform in how we regulated that trade. so that we spoke with one voice when we were regulating trade or setting trade rules with other nations, and that we spoke with one voice in how we were having interstate trade, because we didn't want this union ripping apart because New York was charging more for salamanders coming from Massachusetts than Virginia was charging. And we didn't want those internal trade wars that would rip the country apart. And so we gave the power to the national government to regulate that trade among the states. But that was not a power to regulate how we do our businesses here. It was not a power for Roland to decide how much he had to pay his employees, because he's not engaged in interstate commerce. Sure, some of the arrows he buys probably shipped in interstate commerce, but what he does right here on a daily basis was not an interstate commerce transaction. It's a local transaction, right? And it's not even commerce. Commerce was the trade. He's not doing any trade. He's selling a retail product, a service, a space to shoot. That's not commerce. And yet, in the 1930s, the Congress, with the president's urging, started saying anything that is economic in nature. And by the way, the Chamber of Commerce probably didn't help with this. They call it the Chamber of Commerce, and everybody thinks now commerce means business. For the founders, it meant trade. It didn't mean retail. It didn't mean manufacturing. It didn't mean agriculture. It meant the trade in the goods across state lines. That was the commerce, and we needed the federal government to regulate that so we wouldn't have these state wars. But I didn't have to have the federal government telling me what I could do in my own manufacturing plant. If there was a government that was going to tell me what to do in my own manufacturing plant, it was going to be my local government, my state government, where I could throw them out more easily if I didn't like what they were doing. Right? That transformation greatly expanded the scope of the national government. And with its expansion, the federal government now all of a sudden needed a lot more revenues to be able to accomplish all these new things that they were going to do. And they developed this notion that ordinary people weren't capable of governing themselves. Right? Those 55 men in the room may have been extraordinary people, but they were farmers, there were some lawyers, there were some merchants, there were some silversmiths. They were craftsmen and tradesmen like we are. And they gave us the greatest constitutional system the world has ever seen. And yet somehow in the 1930s, they call them Felix Frankfurter's best and the brightest, all the boys from Harvard, that knew better how to govern ourselves than we did. And they were going to come in and they were going to go into government. And they were going to come up with all the rules to make our government perfect. Right? It wasn't going to be anymore about securing our inalienable rights. Government was going to make heaven on earth. It was going to make all the ills of society go away. Well, James Madison must have been rolling over in his grave, because a government that is so powerful that they can make all the ills of society go away is so powerful that they can be the cause of all such ills as well. And that's what we've seen. Since the mid-1930s, we've seen the government expanding greatly. Now, as a result of this expansion, they run up against these old limits on the Constitution. Because the Constitution's structure is designed to make it hard to pass all sorts of laws that intrude on our liberties. Separation of powers makes that a tough thing. So what do they want to do? They want to get rid of separation of powers. They want to stop the gridlock in Washington. If we could just get rid of the gridlock, government could do a lot more good for our society. And in fact, let's just get rid of Congress altogether. Why not create administrative agencies that don't have to face election? Because we know what happens when you have to face election, that the people might throw you out of office if you do things they don't like. Right? And you're smarter than they are, and so you ought to be given a free hand to do what is good for them, even if they don't know it. Right? So we create these administrative agencies, and we people them with a bunch of these experts. And the president now is responsible for them, because they're all in the executive branch. And it turns out he has to face election too. So they say, oh, that's not going to do any good. So they then start creating independent agencies that the president himself can't even fire the people. Right? And somehow they're accountable to the people, even though we didn't elect them. The people we did elect can't fire them. And it sets up, well, Congress, why did Congress go along with this delegation of all of their lawmaking powers to unelected officials in the administrative agencies? Well, think about it. Congress gets to take credit for solving the environmental problems. We created the Environmental Protection Agency, right? And they get to take the credit, and then the EPA imposes all these rules where the real costs, where the real rubber hits the road, and nobody can live with the rules that they're paying, right? And so members of Congress said, we solved the problem. It's those bad regulators over there that are causing the problem. Don't blame me, right? But if you give me a donation, I'll make sure that we get your project through, and I'll send a letter over to the EPA. And it becomes their perpetual printing machine for their campaign re-election. So this is a pretty good deal for Congress. And what's happened to liberty in the process? We've got administrative agencies that are passing 100 times more laws, regulations. Look at the size of the Federal Register compared to the size of the Congressional Record or the statute books. It's 10 times, 100 times larger. And that was before November 6th. Watch what happens over the next 90 days in the size of the Federal Register, where all the regulations are published. It's going to be scary, right? And none of them are accountable. And you look at what's happened with the Affordable Care Act. How many people think it's going to be affordable, by the way? All right, the Affordable Care Act, tens of thousands of pages of new regulations, taxes and infringements on liberty. And who do I go after? Who do I hold accountable? Well, yeah, technically the president and technically the members of Congress, but there are thousands of new revenuers. What the Declaration says, that one of the accusations, the charges against the king was he deputized all sorts of revenue agents to come in and harass our people and eat out our substance. Right. Well, this is what they're doing in the Obamacare legislation. So let me talk a little bit about the Supreme Court and its abdication. Its abdication on its oath to defend the Constitution, to uphold it. Chief Justice Marshall said in Marbury versus Madison that it's the duty of the court, when it's confronted with a statute that is inconsistent with the Constitution, to uphold the Constitution and not the statute. In McCulloch versus Maryland, he says, if Congress ever, on the pretense of exercising its powers, seeks to accomplish ends not given to it, it will be the painful duty of this court to say that such a law is void. Well, the Obama Health Care Act is not a regulation of commerce. 5 members of the court said that it was not a valid exercise of Congress's power to regulate commerce among the states. I can't force you to engage in commerce in order to create the commerce that I now have the authority to regulate. Now, if that's where they had ended, I'd be happy. But then the Chief Justice of the United States, another one of the people that took the oath, said, I'm going to rewrite this statute to find a way to save it constitutionally. I'm going to say, oh, Congress could, I suppose, have done this by creating a tax and then imposing a tax on us all, and then if you buy the policy that the government wants you to buy, even if you don't want it, we'll give you a deduction, a reduction in that tax. And that would be constitutional, because the taxing power is unlimited, the Chief Justice tells us. Well, Mr. Chief Justice, it's not unlimited. There are all sorts of restrictions in the Constitution on the power to tax. Excises and imposts and duties have to be uniform in the different regions of the country. Direct taxes, that is a tax on anybody just for living, which is what this is, have to be apportioned according to population among the states. Why is that? Why is that? It was the same reason why we gave the power to the national government to regulate interstate commerce in the first place. We did not want the states to be at war with one another. And if I allow the states to have their own commerce regulations and impose different rules on trade coming from South Carolina versus on coming from Georgia, I engender animosity among the states. Well, if I tax one region of the country to pay for benefits in another region of the country, I also generate animosity among the states that risk threatening ripping the union apart. And so the Constitution built in restrictions on the taxing power to make that not possible. Excises had to be uniform. Direct taxes had to be apportioned according to population. I couldn't use those things to transfer wealth from one region or group of people to another. The Chief Justice nevertheless allowed this as a direct tax. Well, he said it wasn't a direct tax, and here's his reasoning, and it's unbelievably bad. He says there's been an argument raised that if we allow this as a tax, it's a direct tax, and therefore unconstitutional because not apportioned according to population. And he says, well, what is a direct tax? Our Constitution says it's a tax that has to be apportioned according to population. Since this one is not, it must not be a direct tax. Now think about that for a minute, how circular that is. The actual reasoning is, since it's a direct tax, if it's not apportioned according to population, it's an unconstitutional direct tax. He says it's not a direct tax. He doesn't tell us what it is. But it's got to be one or the other of those provisions in the Constitution that give that power in the first place. He never tells us what kind of tax it is. Now, there's another reason that thing was unconstitutional as a tax. So another provision in the Constitution that says all bills seeking to raise revenue, to impose taxes, have to originate in the House of Representatives. This one originated in the United States Senate. Yeah, that's just being unduly formalistic, isn't it? Who cares whether it originates with John Boehner's committee or Harry Reid's committee? It's still coming out of Washington, right? Well, why should we care? Well, the senators are now directly elected, but they still stand for election only every 6th year. They represent states, not the population. The most directly accountable representatives in our national government are the members of the House of Representatives. They have to face election every 2 years, every single one of them, in small districts, where I'll bet if you really work at it, you can actually meet them every once in a while. Right? You can hold them accountable in a way that it's harder to do with the United States Senator and harder still to do with the President of the United States. That's why that clause is there. Because if the members of our government were going to impose taxes on us, they had to face the piper, us, the voters, the ultimate sovereign. They had to face that at the very next election. And therefore, they would only raise taxes, impose taxes on us, if it was absolutely necessary, and we all agreed that it was necessary. That's why that clause was there. Now you strip away that clause and you insulate them from having to suffer the wrath of voters for imposing an unjust or an unnecessary tax. Right? Which is exactly what this whole charade was designed to do. I mean, heck, they didn't even call it a tax. Now technically, what Harry Reid did in the Senate was amend a House of Representatives bill. See, they had a bill sitting there in committee that wasn't going anywhere. I forget what it was going to do. It was going to give a mortgage deduction to widows of Marines who were killed in Iraq or something. I forget what it was. And it was just sitting there. It had nothing to do with appropriations and raising taxes. And Harry Reid took that bill and said, here's a piece of paper with a House of Representatives bill number on it. HR something or other. Let's get rid of all of that stuff that's in there, strip it down to nothing, and then pour in 2,700 pages of the Affordable Care Act bill. Because the Constitution says all bills raising revenue have to originate in the House of Representatives, but it says the Senate gets to amend them. So we're just making an amendment of a House bill, and therefore we've met the formal requirement of the Constitution. What a fraud. What a fraud. And that Chief Justice Roberts wouldn't even mention this fraud in his opinion is dishonest. Now, there is a lawsuit pending challenging just that piece. Now, the Supreme Court in the past, has allowed pretty significant amendments to House appropriations bills where they poured a whole lot of stuff. They weren't amendments, they were really pile-ons. But never in our history have they allowed a full strip and amend fraud as this one was. I don't know whether that case is going to ultimately succeed or not, but it ought to, because there's a reason for that clause. The reason is that it's we the people who have the ultimate authority, and the way we protect that authority is by ensuring that those who do such things to us through our legislation have to face our wrath or our approval at the very next election. If that turns out no longer to be true, then we are no longer a self-governing people worthy of the name, those first 3 words in our preamble, we the people. And that's why groups like this all over the country are meeting on Wednesday nights and on Tuesday nights and on Thursday nights and on Saturday afternoons all over the country. We had a little setback on constitutionalism in November. But we're meeting all over the country because we are adamant about insisting that our constitutional order be respected, be honored, be complied with, and we are going to hold accountable, eventually, those that fail in exercising their vote. If I may, let me shift to a foreign policy question of the day, because this too is an oath-breaking issue. The foreign policy issue of the day right now, although it's kind of getting watered down with the other events and the fiscal cliff going off and all these things. But the stuff that went on in Libya in the 2 months leading up to the election had its direct root in an unconstitutional act of the President of the United States. Now, I'm a big defender of presidential authority. I think that the President doesn't need an act of Congress to go to war every time we get attacked. I think the President as Commander-in-Chief and the occupier as the executive power under Article 2 has immense authority that we elected him to exercise directly from the Constitution. He can, for example, send our troops overseas in order to defend our national interests anywhere on the globe. Congress's check on that power is its appropriation power. He doesn't have to have advance approval. But if I'm sending troops over not to protect a national security interest of the United States, but to just intervene in someplace else because I think it would be good policy, I'd like to weigh in on this civil war because I like this faction rather than that faction. That the President cannot do. The Constitution spells out that the power to declare war, and it doesn't have to be a formal declaration, it can be an authorization of force, which in our nation's history is used more often than the declaration of war. But the authority has to come from Congress itself. Why? Because Congress exercises the lawmaking power. They're more directly accountable to the people. They will only be able to take that step if the people are behind it. That's the theory. In Libya, when the Civil War arose, the President unilaterally determined to weigh in on one side rather than the other. He did not ask Congress for authority. He did not ask Congress for approval or for an authorization, much less a declaration of war. Instead, he claimed that he had all the authority he needed, not because of Article 2 of the Constitution. I would have quibbled with him over that, but it at least would have been constitutional claim. He claimed that he had all the authority that he needed because the United Nations had told him he had the authority. Now that is not the constitutional system we have. The people that run the United Nations are no part of we the people that delegated the sovereign authority to the United States. Now why did it yield the kind of backlash that we saw in Libya? I suspect that had the President followed the constitutional process and submitted this to Congress for deliberation and debate and approval, I suspect somebody might have asked the following question. We know that this guy Gaddafi has been in Libya for a long time and he's a very bad guy. But our foreign policy cannot just support good guys. Oftentimes in the rest of the world there are bad guys that are in control. Our foreign policy also always has to be, is this bad guy better or worse than the next bad guy that comes in going to be for the United States national security? Right? Remember, Winston Churchill once said he would enter into a pact with the devil to stop Hitler. That's a pretty bad guy. But it demonstrated that Hitler's badness was even more urgent and more immediate. Right? The question we had to ask with Gaddafi, despite all his heinous acts, both against his own people and against the United States, was the fact that he was backing down, that he had rejected his own nuclear program, that he was starting to support Israel, that he was starting to come our way. He was retiring. Was he more likely to be harmful to U.S. interests, or was the faction supported by Al-Qaeda, that was the Muslim Brotherhood, that were part of the Revolutionary Guard in the uprising, more likely to be harmful? That's right. All right? So that question would have been asked, just simple. Are what we're likely to get going to be more supportive of United States interests or less? And if that question was asked, and if you looked at it closely, I think the answer was self-evident, that it was going to be less beneficial to our security interests. He didn't have that conversation because he didn't follow the constitutional process. And what were the consequences? The consequences were an armed gang, armed and supported by enemies of the United States, attacked the sovereign authority, the sovereign territory, and the sovereign person in our ambassador with weapons that we undoubtedly provided. These are the consequences of failing to comply with the constitutional process that was set out. Now, there's lots of other examples. I could go on and on and on. It seems to me the greatest danger is nobody cares that the constitutional processes are not followed. We do in this room, but let's talk about the people in California at the last election.
There were two generals and one admiral that was sacked trying to come to their protection.
I know, and it's unbelievable. So let's ask about the people of California, because we've got another problem. This is not just a lack of oath keeping by our elected officials who swear that oath. We've got a moral rot that has taken root in the American citizenry itself, and I think we have to confront that as well. Look at the two tax bills, the tax initiatives that were on the ballot in California. One of them was going to impose, now both of them are going to end up imposing taxes on everybody, but that was not the way they were sold. Proposition 38 was going to impose an increase in income taxes on everybody. We were going to vote to tax ourselves because we thought we needed the money for certain services. That one failed 75 to 25. Don't want to tax ourselves. The other one that passed, Proposition 30, was sold as you get all these goodies by only taxing the other guy, right? And now that principle of the direct tax that I talked about earlier was designed to prohibit transfers of wealth from one region to another, but it was also designed to prohibit transfers of wealth from one group of people to another. We should all contribute to pay for the common defense, the things of national interest. But the notion that we're taxing other people to grab money for ourselves, that's not tax for the common good. That's a transfer of wealth for private gain. Madison says in one of his, there are certain things that are just not law, even if they're passed. And his example he gives, taking money from A to give to B, that there's no sense in that ever can be just, he says. And it would therefore not be law even if the legislature passed it. Astounding. And yet that's exactly what we did. Or that's the bill of goods we were sold in Proposition 30. Right? And it's the bill of goods we're being sold on the fight over the fiscal cliff in Washington, D.C. right now. That we can get all these, you know what? We're $16 trillion in debt at the national level. And there's an article in the Wall Street Journal this morning by our former congressman here in Orange County, Chris Cox, former chairman of the Securities Exchange Commission. He says we're not $16 trillion in debt. We're $86.3 trillion in debt when you add in the unfunded liabilities. 86 trillion.
What is that?
We can't even begin to imagine. That's like $300,000 per every man, woman, and child.
Oh, no, it's 200 and some even just with the 16 trillion.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's 5 times that. It's huge. It's huge. We can't ever pay it. Now why is that? It's because we have bought into this bill of goods that I can tax other people and claim benefits for myself. It can't work. And the moral rot and the dependency that is flowing from this view that started to take root in the 1930s, when the government started to say, we can take care of you from cradle to grave, and you will be free because you will be free. Remember Franklin Roosevelt's claim? He said, we're now going to have freedom from fear, freedom from want. This will be the new liberty. Well, a government that is strong enough to give us that is a government that actually makes us dependent and therefore enslaved. This is the greater rot that we have to address, and it's becoming endemic, and it may be coming to the point of no return. It's up to us to try and convince our fellow citizens that there's a better path, the path that our founders in 1776 set out. that recognizes each of us have inalienable rights, and we're each clever enough to figure out how to make our way our own. We'll provide some safety nets in our local communities, because then we can tell the difference between a bum and somebody falling on hard times, right? And we can do that a whole lot better in our communities and our churches than we can do from some bureaucratic desk in Washington, D.C. And we need to rebuild that sense of what it really is to be an American. And I think we can get back our country. But if we don't solve that moral rot, we can't.
That's right.
Those are the fights ahead of us, and they're significant. But they pale in comparison to the fight that Washington and his colleagues had to face in 1774, 75, 76, the loss and battles of Trenton, the winters of Valley Forge. We can win this fight if we just remain rededicated to it. Thank you very much, and I'll take some questions.
And I went down to camp along with Captain Gooding, and there we saw the men and boys as thick as hasty pudding. Yankee Doodle, keep it up, Yankee Doodle dandy. Mind the music and the step, and with the girls be handy. And there was General Washington upon a